To conclude World War II in Chapter 25, ladies and gentlemen, we will go over the political results of World War II, but we would be remiss without some discussion of the Holocaust, which altogether, what the Nazis called their final solution to the Jewish problem, between 5 and 6 million Jews, more than 3 million of them were killed in the death camps, in genocide operations in places like Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Dachau. And about 90% of the Jewish populations of Poland, the Baltic countries, and Germany were exterminated. Overall, the Holocaust was responsible for the death of nearly 2 of every 3 Jews in Europe. And the Nazis were also responsible for another Holocaust, the death by shooting, starvation, or overwork of at least another 9 to 10 million people. The gypsies of Europe, the subhuman, quote-unquote, Slavic peoples, the clergy, the intelligentsia, civil leaders, judges, and lawyers were arrested and deliberately killed. Probably an additional 4 million Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians lost their lives as slave laborers for Nazi Germany, and 3 to 4 million Soviet prisoners of war were killed in captivity. The Nazis also singled out homosexuals for persecution, and thousands lost their lives in concentration camps. And there's a picture of some Holocaust survivors after the American troops liberated Mauthausen concentration camp in May of 1945, and they tattooed all the Jews. You can see the tattoos there on the chest or underneath the arms. Was another area they did this as well as identification. Unbelievable. And what about the new order in Asia that comes about? And Japan, as we mentioned, had hoped to use its new possessions to meet its burgeoning needs for raw materials such as tin, oil, and rubber, and also as an outlet for Japanese manufactured goods. We talked about this imperialism, and to provide an organizational structure for the arrangement, they set up the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. We mentioned this in a previous video. It was supposed to be a self-sufficient economic community designed to provide mutual benefits for the occupied areas and the home country. And it was done under the slogan of Asia for the Asians. And they established independent governments in places like Burma and the Dutch East Indies, Vietnam, and the Philippines. But, in fact, the real power rested with the Japanese military authorities in each territory, and the local Japanese military command was directly subordinated to the Army General Staff in Tokyo, and the economic resources of the colonies were exploited for the benefit of the Japanese war machine. And while the natives were recruited to serve in local military units or conscripted to work on public works projects. In some cases, the people living in the occupied areas were subject to severe hardships. In Indochina, for example, the forced requisitions of rice by the local Japanese authorities for shipment abroad created a food shortage that caused the starvation of more than 1 million Vietnamese in 1944 and 1945. And like the German soldiers in occupied Europe, Japanese military forces often had little respect for the lives of their subject peoples. In their conquest of Nanjing, China, in 1937, Japanese soldiers had devoted several days to killing, raping, and looting. Almost 800,000 Koreans were sent overseas, most of them as forced laborers to Japan. Tens of thousands of women from Korea and the Philippines were forced to be comfort women or prostitutes for the Japanese troops. And the Japanese also made extensive use of both prisoners of war and local people as laborers on construction projects for the war effort. In building the Burma to Thailand Railway in 1943, for example, the Japanese used 61,000 Australian, British, and Dutch prisoners of war and almost 300,000 workers from Burma, Malay, Thailand, and the Dutch East Indies. And Bridge over the River Kwai, 1957 Hollywood movie by David Lean, is an awesome picture about construction of a railway in that part of the world. And by the time the railway was completed, 12,000 Allied prisoners of war and 90,000 local workers had died from inadequate diet and appalling work conditions in an unhealthy climate. And so this is a big reason why the Japanese lose in the Pacific as well, ladies and gentlemen. They created so much ill will in all of the areas of this so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that they had almost no support from the indigenous populations. And another big political result of World War II will be the process of decolonization. And during the war, the Japanese had already humiliated the Western states by overrunning their colonial empires. In addition, colonial soldiers who had fought on behalf of the Allies, India, for example, had contributed large numbers of troops to the British Indian Army. And they're well aware the Allied war aims included the principle of self-determination for the peoples of the world. Equally important to the process of decolonization, the power of the European states had been destroyed by the exhaustive struggles of World War II. The greatest empire builder, Great Britain, no longer had the energy or the wealth to maintain its empire. Given this combination of circumstances, the rush of decolonization swept the world after the war. And here are some political results, a nice political map of Europe. And in Berlin, the city will be divided and occupied by the Soviets in East Berlin. As we'll see in the next chapter on the Cold War, this is what it's all about. Berlin is the symbol city of the Cold War. And in West Berlin, there will be French, British, and U.S. occupation in different areas. And Checkpoint Charlie in the American sector will divide East and West Berlin. Here's the Iron Curtain. Behind the Iron Curtain, East is dominated by the Soviet Union. All of these areas will have governments established that are sympathetic or directly under Soviet hegemony. In the West, it will be all these different countries that have democratically oriented and capitalistic societies. And the Soviets gained so much territory as a result of World War II at the expense of the Germans. And also, these areas, for a time, are occupied by the British and the Americans. And there's a French and British zone here. Here's another American zone, another U.S. zone, and the United States still has troops in many of these areas of Western Europe to this day. And in Japan, the United States will have an occupied government there under MacArthur for a time, and by 1951, they have a democratically elected government in power there. And many of the islands of the Pacific will come under American hegemony for many, many years to come. And after the war, as we'll see in chapter 26 on the Cold War, the war between the communists and the nationalists will continue in China. That ends chapter 25.